The forest kingdom breathes in silence. Chapter 10. The Meal at the Stone Table. Morning in Elarwyn arrived without announcement. There was no change in light that Lira could point to as the moment of it. No sunrise, no abrupt shift from dark to pale. The moss light simply began to thin as the canopy light began to build. The two processes occurring simultaneously, each withdrawing and arriving at the same gradual rate, so that the illumination in the valley never fully ceased and never dramatically renewed. The result was a continuous light that moved through gradations so slow as to be imperceptible at any given moment, and yet by the time she was fully awake, the valley was its daytime self. Again the isotropic pale green-white, the surfaces present and specific. The channel's luminescence subsided into its daylight version of moving grey-green water. She lay still for a few minutes and let the morning establish itself around her. The sound had changed overnight. The collective texture of the Quietkin's evening activity had been replaced by something slightly different. The sounds of morning tasks, which she was beginning to be able to distinguish from evening ones, though she could not have said precisely how. Something in the tempo. Evening tasks had the rhythm of winding down, of things being completed and set aside. Morning tasks had the rhythm of beginning the same unhurried quality, but moving outward rather than inward. Water being drawn, materials being taken up, the carved tool on the highest ledge resuming its slow horizontal stroke. Cael was already at the recess entrance, sitting on the stone with his legs hanging over the edge and his journal. The writing one this time, the one with pages rather than pressed leaves, open across his knee. She could not see what he was writing from this angle. She did not need to. He was doing what he always did in places that required it, putting it down in words before the words escaped him, making the record before the experience receded far enough that memory began to improve it. She folded the woven fabric carefully. She was not certain of the correct way to leave it folded or rolled or arranged flat, and she chose folded because folded was what it had been when she arrived, and returning things to the state they had been in before you used them seemed like the right instinct in this place. She set it at the platform's head. She put on her boots. Outside the recess, the valley air was cool and carried, as it always carried, its mineral green quality. The smell of wet stone and living moss and water that had been in contact with very old limestone for a very long time. She breathed it in and felt the same thing she had felt on first descent the day before, the involuntary slowing, the body's adjustment to an air that moved differently through it. Senne was at the channel. She was always at the channel when there was work to be done at the channel, and there was always work to be done at the channel. This morning she was clearing a section of the cut edge where the valley floor ground cover had extended its roots into the stone's joint. Over decades, require a more significant response. She worked with the fine cutting tool from the shelf, moving it along the joint with the same steady horizontal stroke she had given everything. Thorough, unhurried, requiring no audience. She looked up when they brought the horses to the channel to drink one final time. She looked at them with the complete attention she always gave both of them, the horses, the packs, the map tube at Lira's side, a full accounting. Then she returned to the joint and the cutting tool. Lira stood at the channel's edge and watched the water for a moment. The 3 registers, as they had been since she first heard them descending into the valley 2 days ago. She listened for each one separately, the low resonance in the stone, the mid-register's moving clarity, the high bright thread from the north, and then for all 3 together. She wanted to carry the chord forward accurately, not as a sound she remembered, but as a relationship she understood. 3 sources, 1 system, engineered to be this, maintained to remain this, continuous across 600 years of daily attention. She would remember it. She knew the particular quality of memories made in places of total presence, how they did not fade the way ordinary memories faded, but held their sensory specificity for years, arriving complete and unaltered when the right association summoned them. She would be in an archive in some city in some future year, bent over a document in the particular posture of that work, and she would hear 3 registers of water simultaneously in the back of her mind, and she would know exactly where she was when she learned that sound. Senne set down the cutting tool. She stood and looked at Lira directly. The expression was the one Lira had been unable to name on first encounter, and could name now. Not warmth performed, not warmth withheld, but warmth in the form of complete presence, the fullest attention one person could give another without requiring anything in return. Lira looked back. She did not speak. She had not, she realized, spoken to Senne in the way she spoke to people in the outside world, with the layered purposes of speech, the information transfer, and the relationship management, and the social maintenance. She had communicated with Senne the way the valley communicated, through presence, through gesture, through the patient accumulation of being in the same space and meaning something by it. She pressed the loop on her finger, the dried loop Senne had left at her place the day before, against her palm, feeling its slight dried warmth. Senne looked at the map tube. She looked at Lira's face, a new one, lower than the others, moving through the air between them, like something set into motion carefully so it would arrive intact. Lira did not know what it meant in the language that contained it. She knew what it meant. Go well, and come back if the map finds you again, and we will be here, and we have always been here, and that is the only thing we were ever trying to tell you. Lira put her hand on the channel's cut stone. The cold of it came up through her palm, familiar now, specific in the way that the cold of this channel was different from the cold of any other stone she had touched. She held it for a moment, then she lifted her hand. She turned and mounted Fen. The clearing was different in the morning. She had been there twice before, once in the afternoon light, once in the moss-lit evening. In the morning it had a quality she had not anticipated. The circle of sky overhead was pale and close, the clouds thin enough that the light coming through had more direction than the valley's usual isotropic distribution, a light that had a source somewhere above and was making its way down, and by the time it arrived, it had lost its directionality, but retained its brightness. The stone table was set. This was the word for it. The table had been set, though the components of it were entirely unlike anything the word usually implied. No cloth, no arrangement of vessels in a formal pattern, but the table's surface had been cleared of everything except what was intended, and what was intended was present. a wide, shallow bowl at the center, the dark stone material she had seen in the water vessel, containing something that produced a warmth visible in the morning air as a faint rise from its surface. Several smaller bowls distributed at positions around the table's edge, things that were not utensils exactly, more like shaped implements, 2 flat stones, smooth and slightly cupped, and lengths of something fibrous and dried that she could not immediately identify, and food. She examined it without touching it. On a flat stone to one side of the main bowl, a collection of small items arranged without fuss or decoration, but with obvious care for variety. Things she recognized: a root vegetable she had seen in the valley floor's ground cover, cooked to a softness that made it shine. A cluster of the dark green ledge plants, their texture changed by heat, releasing a smell that was both green and mineral. A fungal growth, sliced, its interior pale and dense, things she didn't. 2 preparations that were not immediately identifiable as plant or mineral, or anything she had vocabulary for, rendered in ways that suggested complex processes, the kind of processes that required long familiarity with the raw material. She thought, this food has been developing here for 600 years, not the specific dishes, the knowledge to make them. The accumulated understanding of what the valley produced, what was edible and what wasn't, how to prepare it in ways that worked, what combinations were satisfying, what processes made the raw materials into something that nourished and pleased. 600 years of cooking the same valley's provisions and arriving, generation by generation, at exactly this. The quiet kin arrived in the way they did everything without announcement, without the formality of entrance. They were simply not present, and then present, emerging from the elder trees and the fern corridor and the path along the cliff face in 1s and 2s, each taking a position at the table or at the low stones around the clearing's edge, as if positions had been established and were simply being resumed. 7 of them this morning, including Senne. No signal for beginning, no moment of collective ceremony. The oldest among them, a man whose white hair matched Senne's and whose hands on the table had the same large-knuckled, specifically calloused quality, leaned forward and took from the prepared stone a portion of the root vegetable and placed it in the small bowl before him, and that was the beginning. Lira served herself from the flat stone. She chose by proximity and by smell the dark green plants and a portion of one of the unidentifiable preparations, which up close had a complex warm smell that she associated with long, slow cooking in enclosed heat. She lifted the flat, smooth stone implement and found that it worked as she had intuited from looking at it, as both scoop and surface, comfortable in the hand once held correctly. The food was extraordinary, not in the way of complexity or drama, in the way of specificity. The root vegetable tasted completely of itself, without any of the modification that outside cooking usually applied, without the obscuring of the vegetable's own flavor by stronger additions. It tasted like the soil it had come from, in the best possible sense, mineral. Slightly sweet, with an undertone that she associated now with the valley's particular limestone and the specific cold of its water. The dark green plants had a slight bitterness that the cooking had turned into something more like intensity, the kind of bitterness that made the palate more alert to everything that followed it. She was aware, eating, of the quality of attention in the clearing, at least not primarily. The quiet kin ate with the same focus they brought to their work, the same quality of being fully present in what they were doing, in the way that was rare enough in the outside world to feel notable when encountered. They were not performing the meal for anyone. They were simply having it, with complete attention to the experience of having it. The amber liquid arrived in the smaller vessels, Senne moving around the table and filling each one from the main bowl. Lira took hers and held it as she had learned to hold it in both hands, letting the warmth pass through her palms before she drank. The taste was the same, roasted green. The middle register she had not identified, but different in the morning, lighter somehow. The same elements, but arranged differently. The way a room looked different in morning light than in evening light. Not because anything in it had changed, but because the light itself changed what it emphasized. It was somewhere in the middle of the meal that it arrived. She had been thinking continuously since yesterday. Not a discovery in the mode of the map room's realization, with its architecture of evidence building to a conclusion. Something quieter than both. More like the feeling of something that had been slightly out of alignment, completing its adjustment. A settling. The quiet kin were not looking at her. That was the thing. That was the specific thing. And it took her until this moment to understand what it meant and why it mattered. In the outside world, she was always being looked at in a particular way. She was a woman who worked in archives, who catalogued old maps, who traveled to unusual places and produced careful accounts of what she found there. She was, in other words, defined by her usefulness, by the product of her attention. People looked at her and saw, variously, the expert, the authority, the instrument of documentation. She was valuable for what she produced. Her presence was justified by her function. Here, no one wanted a record. Here, no one was looking at her and calculating her usefulness. No one was treating her presence as something that required justification or could be exchanged for knowledge. The oldest man at the table, who had not acknowledged her arrival and had not acknowledged her through the meal, she noticed without turning to look directly, simply eating, and occasionally looking at the sky, and occasionally exchanging a low sound with the person beside him. He was not thinking about her. She was not an instrument here. She was a guest. The distinction was so large, and she had apparently been living inside it without seeing its edges for so long, that recognizing it now produced something that was not quite the sensation she expected. Not relief exactly. More like the specific feeling of setting down a weight you had been carrying for long enough that you had stopped registering it as weight and had come to think of it as simply your own particular shape. And then you set it down, and the shape of you without it was unfamiliar, slightly strange, requiring a moment to inhabit correctly. She was 34 years old and had spent 12 years in professional cartography and archives, and for the first time she could identify. No one present was looking at her to see what she could tell them. She looked at the food in her small bowl. She looked at the table's worn center, the smoothness of long use. She looked at Senne across the table, who was not looking at her, but at the circle of sky overhead, with a slight tilt of her head that suggested she was making some assessment about the afternoon's weather. She looked at Cael beside her. He was looking at her. Not with the calculating quality she was thinking about. He was looking at her in the way he looked at things he had been paying quiet attention to, and had arrived, through that attention, at something he wanted her to know he had arrived at. His expression was the open one, the one that happened when understanding came through the body rather than the mind. She said quietly, "Do you know what this is?" He looked at her for a moment longer. "You're here," he said, simply, as if it were the most complete answer he had, as if it were. She understood what he meant. Not here in the valley. She had been here since the descent. Here as in present, fully, without the instrument of herself, positioned between her and the experience of being somewhere, without the professional distance, without the documentation impulse, managing everything into categories before she had finished feeling it. She was, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, simply in a place, without being the person who would later account for it. The oldest man at the table set down his bowl. He reached across to the flat stone and took a small portion of one of the unidentifiable preparations, the one she had not tried, the denser of the two, and placed it in his bowl with the unhurried precision of someone who knew exactly how much of it he wanted. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. His eyes were very dark, the same complete, non-demanding attention she had seen in Senne, but in his face it was older, a longer practice of looking at things without wanting anything from them. He looked at her exactly as he had looked at the food in his bowl, with total presence and no expectation. She held his gaze. She did not offer him anything. She did not perform any expression of gratitude or explanation or professional deference. She simply looked back, present, not the instrument of herself, just herself. He returned to his food. It was the smallest possible exchange. Nothing had been communicated in any conventional sense. No information transferred, no relationship formalized. Just two people in the same place, making eye contact without agenda, and then both returning their attention to the morning and the food and the sound of the water below. She sat with what remained of it in her chest, the specific temperature of a space where something had been set down and not picked up again. She thought, "I am going to remember this meal for the rest of my life. Not because anything was said, not because anything was resolved or revealed or documented, because I was here entirely, and the place knew it, and that was sufficient." Cael reached across and added a portion of the root vegetable to her bowl, a small one, just enough to finish the meal on. He did not ask. He had been watching what she was eating, and had noticed the bowl was nearly empty, and had done the ordinary thing, the thing one person at a table did for another without announcing it. She ate it. The morning continued to hold them all in its pale and even light. The sky above the clearing moved its slow cloud passage. The water below ran its ancient chord. Senne finished her assessment of the weather and returned to her bowl with the satisfaction of someone who had checked a thing and found it as expected. The meal ended in the same way it had begun. One person rising, and another, the stone implements cleaned in water from a small vessel, the bowls stacked with the precision of things being returned to their positions. The oldest man rose last. He stood for a moment looking at the sky again, and then walked out of the clearing in the direction of the cliff face, moving at the pace of someone with somewhere to be, with the particular economy of people, for whom the transitions between tasks were continuous rather than interrupted by the task of deciding what to do next. The others followed, in their own time, in their own directions. Senne remained. She was gathering the implements with the thoroughness of someone responsible for the space, checking that everything was as it should be, doing the small work of returning the clearing to its state of readiness. She moved around the table's circumference, pausing at each position to confirm it. She paused at the position Cael had occupied the previous afternoon. She looked at the table's surface there, and then she reached into her garment and produced something small, which she set on the stone. A length of something dried and flat, the color of the valley's oldest stone, tied in a loose loop with a thin strip of the same material. She set it at Lira's position on the table, and then she stepped back and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at Lira. Lira came to the table and picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. The dried material was the same as what she had seen on the prepared stone at the meal's beginning, the fibrous lengths she hadn't been able to identify. Up close, it had a smell, faint, warm, the smell of something that had been dried slowly in still air and had kept, in its desiccation, a memory of warmth. She turned it in her hands. The loop was not decorative. It was functional sized, she realized, for a finger, a marker, the kind used to hold a place, in a document, in a map, in a book. She looked at Senne. She wanted to say something and did not have the language for it, which she had come to understand was not a limitation of this encounter, but a feature of it. The things that could be said were already being said. The things that couldn't be said were the things that mattered. She pressed the loop onto the index finger of her right hand, the one with the permanent ink stain. It fit. Senne looked at this with the expression Lira had learned to read as the closest she came to warmth made visible. Then she finished her circuit of the table and walked out of the clearing in the direction of the channels. Cael had been standing at the clearing's edge, giving her the space that this had required, and knowing without being told that it had required it. He came to the table now and stood beside her and looked at the loop on her finger. She held her hand out and they both looked at it. The dried material, the loop sized for this specific finger, the ink stain underneath it. Old and new in the same small space. "They made this for you," he said. "Yes," she said, "before we arrived." She thought of the sleeping space, the prepared materials, the 15, the count on Senne's hand, the expectation of arrival without the expectation of a specific date. "They made it for whoever came," she said, and it fit. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stone table, at the circle of sky, at the clearing that held the warmth of the morning's meal in its still air. "I think we need to stay one more day," he said. She looked at him. He was describing something he had concluded and was bringing it into the space between them to see if she had concluded the same thing. She had. "Yes," she said. Above them, the sky moved its slow clouds. Below, the water ran its cord through the stone, continuous and patient, and entirely without urgency, the way everything in this valley was entirely without urgency, because the valley had understood long ago that there was no urgency, only continuation, only the daily work of being exactly what you had decided to be, done again and again, with the care that kept the channels clear and the maps legible and the bridges gathering light in the dark. She pressed the loop against her finger and felt its slight warmth, its kept memory of slow-dried air. She stayed at the stone table a moment longer after Cael had gone to tend the horses, in the clearing that was warm and quiet, and held in its stone the record of every person who had ever been the 15th here. The weight of their presence compressed into a warmth that the stone would keep long after she had gone. She pressed her palm flat on the surface, cold underneath and warm above, as it always was, as it always would be.